It's a race that turned down the stretch. And some folk who had vision could see the finish line. It's a race that has been run for 400 plus years. I know there are many in here who have never felt the sting of Jim Crow, never felt the sting of segregation, never felt the sting and hurt of apartheid, never felt the sting of second-class citizenship. And let me say right here, I'm glad that you didn't. But for those of us who sat on the back of the bus, for those of us who drank water out of colored water fountains, for those of us who know how far we have come, we can see a finish line off in the distance. It's a race that has seen the blood, the sweat, and the tears of generations come to her historic head. It's a race that has been run by Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, Nat Turner, Richard Allen, Crispus Attucks, Absalom Jones, Frederick Gordon, W.E.B. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, Marcus Garvey, Booker T. Washington, A. Philip Randolph, and an unknown preacher from Georgia. And now our text says that a cloud of witnesses have gathered and compassed about. Beloved, it was just 45 years ago, on August 28th of 1963, that a prophet of God stood on the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. and prophetically spoke, "I have a dream." Young Martin King stated in his address, "In a sense, we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Martin goes on, "It is obvious today that America has defaulted on its promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity. So we have come to cash this check." Somehow, hear me closely, hear me good. Somehow, Martin King looked into the future and saw what some would say would be impossible. He looked into the future as the prophet Isaiah with eagle eyes and saw a nation come to grips with its true heritage, the heritage of freedom for all of its citizens. 5 years later, the dreamer would be assassinated. And now, 40 years since Martin's untimely death, his dream resurfaces. Now watch this, because I promise you ain't heard it nowhere else. Watch this. In that speech, Martin said, "Let freedom ring." Wait a minute. But the first thing he said was, "Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado." I know ain't nobody thinking about that. Martin looked through time, looked down the time tunnel, Even though he would not physically be there, Martin saw the snow-capped mountains of Colorado. Truly a prophet. A prophet is judged by the fulfillment of his prophecies. And there in this speech, Martin saw, prophesied an event. An event taking place with the Rocky Mountains of Colorado as the backdrop. Many have forgotten this part of the I Have a Dream speech, but I've come here this morning to remind you and the world that Martin saw. He saw the events of 40 years later. Now, you should know by now, if you're a member here and a fair, decent-minded Bible student, that 40 is a significant number. The number 40 has long been universally recognized as an important number in God's holy word, both on the account of the frequency and its occurrence. Its uniformity is found completely throughout God's holy writ. 40 relates to a period of trial and probation. Israel suffered in the wilderness for 40 years until they entered the promised land. Moses was increased in 40-year segments. Moses spent 40 years in Egypt. Moses spent 40 years in Midian. And Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness. 40 is a time of trial. It's a time of probation. It's a time of judgment. It has been 45 years since the dreamer had the dream, but it's been 40 years since the dreamer died. We are living in the time of fulfillment of that dream. We have lived in a time of trial, judgment, and probation. It has been a time of successes, but still a time of trial. Freedom reigned from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado this past Thursday night. Just 43 years ago, the 1965 Voting Rights Act was signed. President Lyndon Baines Johnson, he himself a former segregationist, signed it into law on August 6th of 1965. The act, which closely followed the language of the 15th Amendment, certifies the right of every citizen to vote. Now, in this 40-year span, look what's happened. Without the Voting Rights Act, there wouldn't have been a Thursday night. Come on, stay with me now. You got to keep up. I remember like it was yesterday, my children, my wife. I remember my grandmother, Mary Adkins, living just outside of Greenwood, Mississippi, wanting to vote in 1960 for this young Democrat named John Fitzgerald Kennedy. But they had to take a test, and they had to pay a poll tax. And with a third grade education, Grandmama couldn't pass the test. And being a sharecropper, she certainly didn't have enough money to pay the poll tax. But when you consider the events of Thursday, and the Bible says, stay with me because I'm getting filled right here, that a cloud of witnesses when I think about every black man and black woman that couldn't vote, that were not allowed the opportunity to vote, I know that in that cloud of witnesses are a lot of voters right now. Yes, sir. When I think about those that have come and died for the right for us to vote, those that have beaten and abused. When I think of Congressman John Lewis, and many of you never seen the images of that cross of the Pettus Bridge. I wasn't in that crossing, but I was in the second crossing of the Pettus Bridge on that walk from Selma to Montgomery. And I saw the images of John Lewis beaten to an inch of his life. Beaten physically, bleeding profusely. And he today is the last surviving person that spoke on that August day in 1963. God has a way. Y'all better hear me now. I want you to learn as a church body, as a body of believers, to always look for God in things that are so awesome, because God shows up